Yakar in 1772, and is already functioning as a rebbe within his teacher, the Maggid's lifetime. Then you have, of course, Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who leaves for Eretz Israel in the later 1770s and is here in Tiberias for the next 10 years or so until he passes away. And then you have Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, also Rebbe and the founder of Chabad, who really becomes a leader of his own and founds one of the most important and influential Hasidic courts. In the south, you have Menachem Mendel of Chernobyl, the Chernobyler dynasty, which gives us all of those who have the last name Tursky, come from this. Rizhin comes from this court. Talna, a place close to our own heart, comes from this dynasty. The Chernobyler had only a few children, but his son had 8 children, 8 sons, all of whom became rebels. The Tursky family really took over what we know as Ukrainian Hasidism. The two other, perhaps most important students, and in this I'm doing injustice to all the others, are Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who is a Rav in Pinsk. He's a Rav in Berdichev, and he's an extremely important Hasidic leader there. And Zelachov, before that, I'm sorry. And the final, who I think bears mention, is Rabbi Eli Melech of Rizhensk, the Noam Elimelech, who perhaps more than any of the other of these leaders really spent his life training other leaders. And this is clear for his Sfarim, and this is clear from his disciples. Shneur Zalman of Liadi was concerned with creating Hasidim, and it seems like Rabbi Reb Meilech, as he's known, was concerned with creating tzaddik, was concerned with creating leaders.
So to say his influence is immense, as I understand.
The Maggid? Yeah, I think the Maggid is really one of the most important figures in early Hasidut. You have the Baal Shem Tov, of course, he begins it all, and you have the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya, who is a much better conduit for the Baal Shem Tov's actual teachings. He dies in the 1780s, and it's from his books that we learn most everything we know about the Baal Shem Tov. That being said, if he had a group of disciples, they were a few, and he was a controversial figure, and a darshan and a writer, but he didn't really seem to have trained anyone to take over. Of course, the Hasidic movement at that point wasn't a movement like what we see now. It was just the beginnings of a spiritual path. But the Maggid is really, it's really from his Beit Midrash, from around his table, that Hasidism emerges.
So it's a very broad question, but is there any way that you can help us understand what is the Maggid's specific approach to avoda?
The Maggid's specific approach to avoda. It's a great question. The Baal Shem Tov is a very ecstatic, mystical personality that seems to have been pointed outwards. The Maggid was a deep, introspective, and contemplative mystic. And both of these modalities are very important in Hasidism. Hasidism, as it comes to evolve, uses both of these mystical typologies. That is, engagement with other people, an engagement with this world, a brilliant, fiery ecstasy that you find in the Baal Shem Tov. And the Maggid is still very much grounded in this world, but it's a deeply interior approach to spirituality. And you find resonances of this throughout Hasidism. And Hasidism really embraces and combines both of these two modalities. The Maggid himself is concerned with a few very fundamental issues. Perhaps most importantly is the relationship between Yesh, the physical world, and Ayin, the spiritual world, and the relationship in between that which lies beyond our phenomenal perception, Ayin, and that gives everything vitality, and it's God's expression in the world, and the physical garb that holds it and contains it and gives it any sort of expression in this world. Now, Yesh and Ayin are the same thing.
I think that's a bit difficult for most of us to sort of...
It's a paradox. absolutely. And it is a paradox, and the Maggid understands that, and he's okay with that. Because it's a paradox that allows us to both embrace this world and also understand that when we close our eyes and listen to that bubbling vitality through this world, we hear the expression of something infinite, even within the confines of the infinite. For the Maggid, the mind of the mystic, that means your mind and my mind, really is the font for God's presence in this world. That our minds and our actions become vessels, become conduits for bringing the divine presence into this world and accessing the divine presence that remains latent in all other physical objects of creation. Those nitzotzot, or letters, or, as he often says, the chokhmah that God used to create the world, still exists in all of the physical objects, whether it's a table or a chair or a person. Everything is an expression of that chokhmah. That chokhmah is the ayin, and it's surrounded by a yesh. That yesh is a translation of it that gives it something that you and I can relate to, because chokhmah is not something we can, in its purest form, that divine wisdom, chokhmah, is not something we can really interact with in any meaningful way.
So access to the divine, access to the Shekhinah. So I'm beginning to understand a bit better what the connection with language is there.
So for the Maggid, language is something which both hides and reveals. God uses language to create the world. Language is the substrata that keeps the world enduring. The Asar Mamarot, the 10 utterances that God used to create the world, still exist in the physical world. Those letters are what gives it vitality. This is an idea that he gets from Kabbalat Ari, and also from the Kabbalah of Rabbi Moshe Cordovero of Tzfat, the Ari's teacher. But language also conceals. Language is something that binds. Language is something that gives boundaries. But by giving boundaries and giving expression to something, you are also granted access to something that's even deeper. Through Olam HaDibur, the world of language, you're able to make the transition to Olam HaMachshava, the world of thought, which is a subtler and closer to the world of Chokhmah and Keter. And through the world of thought, you're able to go to a place where even letters don't have any meaning. Even letters are something that can be transcended. You go somewhere even deeper, and that's where the most intense mystical experiences are to be found.
So it's a deeply contemplative tradition.
It is a deeply contemplative tradition. Now, with that being said, I think there have been some scholars who have tried to articulate it in terms of a retreat from this world, a fear of engaging with the physical, and the Maggid doesn't seem to have had that, or at least that alone. We know that he also had ecstatic moments. We know that he, on the one hand, was an ascetic. He kept up that tradition even after having met the Baal Shem Tov. But from the Baal Shem Tov, he imbibed a deeply ferocious, ecstatic side as well, and he was still very much engaged with this world because of this paradox that we've been speaking about. If you leave behind the yish and all you have is the ayin, that's something you can have for a moment, but there's nothing that you can do with that in any sort of enduring way, and there's certainly nothing you can do to help transfer that to another person. You need the yesh. The yesh is something that we very much need. After Yom Kippur, you need Succot. You need something to bring you back to this world and give you physical, or at least more physical kelim in which to bring that spirituality.
So the Sukkah is basically our interface, you could say, with the divine.
We are resting underneath the Tzela de Mehemenuta, the shadow, or perhaps the divine shade. The Shekhinah hovers just above us, and we're down below. And the Sukkah gives us a vessel. For the Mekubalim, the Sukkah is many different symbols, but one of them is the Hey Achrona of the Shem Havaya. We are sitting amidst the name of God, but not the highest letter. We're at the very bottom. But at the very bottom, we're able to look up and to glimpse through to the schach and to realize that there's something above us. It's a very physical plea for us to be a part of. You know, the sukkah is one of only 3 mitzvot that we can do with our entire body. In addition to living in Eretz Yisrael and going to the mikvah, this is one of the only things that you can do with your whole body, to be, move a little bit this way, totally immersed
within the
in a mitzvah.
Sukkot and Daf Hey, the Gemara says the Shekhinah has never lowered itself beyond Asrat Tefachim, and nor has a person, neither Moshe or Eliyahu, risen to the heights of above Asrat Tefachim. So it seems as if they both have to name, both Hashem and us maintain our own shield within a meeting. What do you think the importance of the necessity
Good boundaries.
of boundaries of us maintaining, each having its own, could be a whole autonomy, and yet a place of meeting.
One of my teachers once said, printed this in writing, that one of the greatest gifts that God ever gave us was the illusion of our own personal identity. And I think that there's something very deep in that. Because that's something that defines our world, that boundary. If it's not, I don't think it's a impermeable boundary, which is to say that there's no interface in between the two. It's not a piece of cement that we're sitting underneath. We're sitting underneath something that the halacha needs to be porous. It needs to let through things. Now, we can't sit on top of it, and there's also a gavul that you can't make a sukkah above a certain point. But you can't also, it needs to be a certain height because we need God to be able to rest on it, as it were. And those boundaries are very important.
But the illusion of autonomy, the illusion of a distinct self is, in a certain degree, to a certain sense, where one could say that we're always present with Him, always sort of living within the bubble of Hashem's presence. But whether we're actually available to it, say, or conscious of it, actually can become cognizant, is another question.
I think that in many other places, Chazal talk about the Shekhinah being much more present than in this particular citation. I'll come back to that in just a moment. In Chazal, the Shekhinah is not a hypostatic element. It seems to be just God's presence in this world. For Kabbalah, the Shekhinah is almost a hypostatic element. It's almost something that it can be in conversation with God. It's not nifrad legamre, but it's something that can be in dialogue with the Kadosh Baruch Hu.
Almost an emanation that is
An emanation, right. It's something that we have a relationship with, but can go into galut. It's something that's supposed to be partnered with God, but not something that is always partnered with God. Whereas I can't remember a single rabbinic midrash that says, Amra HaShekhinah Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You would never find that in Chazal. No, in Kabbalah, that's de rigueur. In Chassidut, we have a return to that original understanding of the Shekhinah. In many places, the Molinai and others in the Maggid school say, what is the Shekhinah? The phenomenal existence of this world. She's both the deeper energy, but also really just the physical things. This world is the Shekhinah. We are interacting with the Shekhinah in whatever we are doing. Now,
does that include the obstacles we face as well?
Right? Rabbi Nachman saying this Torah on Moshe Nigash Ela Arafel Kisham Elohim. God was davke in the darkness, and that's a great expression of God. Absolutely. But one of the things that I get from this midrash is that there are still boundaries. There's the Shekhinah that we interact with, and there's the Shekhinah that would be too much for us. And that revelation, at least on Succot, maybe it's different on Yom Kippur. I think for many people, for me it's different on Yom Kippur. We need that intermediate area of the Schach, and we need that boundary. We're here, we're in this world, and the Shechina is HaShechina, but it's something that comes to us via the, I wouldn't say intermediary, but I would say via the translation of the Schach.
The sun, or the Shekhinah, is both an aspect, can be an aspect of judgment, or it can also heal, depending on what degree one is available to receive it.
Right? Whether the Shekhinah comes, whether we receive God's energy, God's Shefa as Gevurot or Chasadim, is something that is to some degree up to us. Some degree up to us, the way that we shape the roof of that governs the way that those energies come into our lives.
So you're mentioning before that there was a Torah from the Morva Shemesh.
He has one very nice piece that will help tie this back into language. This is something that he gets from the Maggid, and of course the Maggid gets from earlier Kabbalah. For Kabbalah, the creation of the world is almost always in Din. It is almost always an expression of God's stricter side, because God had to create boundaries for himself, as it were. God was Ein Sof, all with the light of the divine, and God had to withdraw, as it were, from a certain place in order to create a vacuum in which some sort of, even if it's an artificial, individual identity could be created. So that's an expression of Din. It's an expression of God's willingness to place boundaries for the Maggid, and he gets this from, it is in Kabbalat Ramat, it is every once in a while there, but it's not very common. He says that there's nothing more an expression of God's chesed than the creation of the world. It's not an expression of Din, it's an expression of chesed. Rambam also has this formulation, Chesed Olam Yibaneh, that God created the world to Chesed. Now what the Rambam seems to mean by that is there's nothing you could have actually done to deserve this world. Maral's formulation of the creation of the world as Rachamanut, as an act of compassion. But the Maggid means something a little bit different. The Maggid means that by creating a world, God created physical existence, but he also created people that could give God sha'ashuim. We give to God. God delights in our avoda. But he also, by giving us a physical world, gave us the physical kelim by which to interact with something greater than ourselves. So, just very quickly, the Morva Shemesh points out that there's a halacha that you need to be able to see the kochavim, the stars, through the Schach. No stars tonight, but theoretically you should be able to see them. And he says, kochavim can be broken down into two ways. The first one is Kaf Vav, which is of course 26, the gematria of the Shem Meforash, the divine name. And he says Kaf Bet, it's the second Kochav, represents the 22 letters. He said language can be a helpful metaphor for understanding the stuff. Just as Schach provides the divine sunglass, as it were, it lets through just enough, but not enough that it roasts us. I mean, the halacha, you have to have Zelo Rubo Mishimsho, it needs to be more shade than sun. So too, language is an element that conceals. Anyone who's ever tried to convey something understands that language is something that holds back perhaps even more than it can ever hope to convey. But that being said, it's a divine gift. Language is not something to be circumvented. Language is not something to be avoided. And this is one thing that sets the Jewish mystical tradition apart from many others. That refusal to retreat back into paralyzed silence. Whenever we engage with silence, it's something deeply active in the Jewish world. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the focused intensity of utter concentration. And you find that in the non-Jewish, of course. The way that you get there is unavoidably through language. It can almost never be done in any other way. You go through language because it provides those windows that give you a channel. So the Ma'or B'Shemesh, the Schach is like that. And he relates this to our experience in the Yomim Noraim. Yom Kippur is like awesome for a day, and too much. 2 days, 3 days, 4 days would shatter our kelim. God's chesed is sending us back into the world of Gashmiut in a way that we can actually engage with, in a way that we can sit in the sukkah. We can't fast and daven all day. We can sit with friends and with family in a sukkah, and we can engage with physical things. And by that we can draw the light through the schach into our lives and then out into the rest of the year. But we need that physical kli. So I would say that the Shekhinah doesn't come all the way through. Maybe that's due, but the light of the Shekhinah sure does.
At the very end of the Midrash, it says that Hashem basically spread out His Shekhinah in the form of a cloud over Moshe. And Moshe had to reach up and grab the kisei kavod himself. So his language is that act that you're expressing perhaps of us, of perception, of us taking hold of something. At the very least, to orient ourselves or to make an assessment of where we are in relationship to Ariel, thank you very much. Ariel is also my brother-in-law. It's always a pleasure to talk with him.
Odim l'simcha, good morning.